Hello, I'm Mark Payne. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the West Virginia Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. These presentations are both entertaining and educational. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to nonprofit organizations across West Virginia, such as schools, libraries, historical societies, and a wide range of civic groups. Their presentation fee is paid by the council, and we ask only that their travel costs be covered by the host group. History Live is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. We encourage your organization or school to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Robert E. Lee or Ann Bailey come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures and make them more real. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. The 15 presenters on our History Alive roster have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Alive presentation is not a play. It is very much an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Alive presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we'll change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Alive presentation can add to the offerings at your school or organization. There will be information on the screen at the end of this program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Alive character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio labor activist and political leader, Mr. Eugene Debs.
Comrades, friends, fellow workers, it's good to be back in West Virginia once again, a place I've been so many times in my life. I've come here as a union organizer, building the railroad unions, as a special organizer for the United Mine Workers of America. I've come here as a candidate for the President of the United States, campaigning many times, representing the political party of the working class. And most recently, in 1919, I came here as an official guest, you might say, as a resident of your state prison at Moundsville. And I must say, of all the places I've ever been in prison, and there have been several, this was my favorite place. So once again, it's good to be back here. My name, as you may know, is Eugene V. Debs. Now today, I'm not here as a convict, as far as I know, or as an organizer, and I'm not running for anything at the moment. I'd just like to take a few minutes and look back with you on my life and career in the service of the labor movement. To speak for labor, to plead the cause of the men, women, and children who toil, this for me has always been a great honor, truly a labor of love. If I have one regret in my life, it's not the times that I've been slandered or in prison. The only regret I have is that I've been able to do so little for the movement, which has done so much for me. I guess you could say I became a part of the labor movement when I was 16 years old. I quit school in Terre Haute, Indiana, and went to work on the Vandalia Railroad. My first job consisted of scraping the paint and grease off railroad cars for 50 cents a day. My first 2 days' wages had to go to pay for the scraper. Now, eventually, I worked my way up to painting, and then a turning point came in my life when a man showed up too drunk to do his job, and at age 16, I got a chance to be a locomotive fireman. It was a dangerous, exhausting job, firing the locomotives, keeping them running. I worked that for several years and came to really know the life of the working people, the sorrows, the struggles, and the joys and comradeship. It was something I never forgot. Now, in the 1870s, the Depression came, and I had to go back home to Terre Haute, but I wanted to do whatever I could to build the labor movement. Well, a couple years later, when I was 20 years old, I had my first chance. Old Joshua Leach came to town. Now, he was a Grand Master and founding member of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, early union of railroad workers. And I was recording secretary of the Vigo County Lodge, and I never missed a meeting. Well, some days I'd be the only person who showed up. Now, at the time, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen was not what you might think of as a union. It was, in a sense, like a fraternal society or an insurance club. Our mottos at the time were benevolence, sobriety, and industry. We believed if the working man conducted himself with dignity and did his job competently, his employer would recognize him and treat him accordingly. It was pretty naive. It might have made sense in the days of small business when the owners and the workers knew each other by name and worked side by side, but it was a hopelessly outdated approach in an age of giant corporations and trusts. But it took me a while to figure that out. I remained active in the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen for nearly 20 years. Became very active in the lodge. Eventually I became secretary-treasurer of the organization, edited its magazine. Well, I even began to dabble in democratic politics, I'm ashamed to say. I was elected city clerk in Terre Haute for 2 terms. I think my biggest claim to fame there was that I refused to collect fines on prostitutes when they were arrested. I felt sorry for these unfortunate creatures and didn't want to add to their difficulties. I even served a term in the Indiana State Legislature. I supported a law that would have given women the right to vote, which failed. I supported a bill that would have ended discrimination on the basis of color in the state of Indiana. It failed. I drafted a bill which would have provided for compensation for injured railroad workers. It was killed in a backroom deal. So eventually I concentrated on building the labor movement, traveling around the country, not only organizing locomotive firemen, but other members of the Railroad Brotherhoods and any other union in any way that I possibly could. But I came to understand something in the course of my struggles and travels, and that is that the labor movement at the time was not scientifically organized to meet the challenges of the day. Well, to take the railroad industry alone, within that one industry you might have as many as a dozen different unions, each representing a small group of workers. Now, when you're trying to struggle together against a giant corporation, instead of acting as one group would often be pitted against another. One group would scab when another group would go on strike. So I came to understand that the only way that working people can truly fight for their dignity on the job effectively was to organize in industrial unions where all the workers, skilled and unskilled, could belong together in one union. So in 1893, I became a founder of the American Railway Union. It was one of the first attempts to build industrial unionism in the country. Another early attempt was the United Mine Workers, as my friends and comrades in West Virginia know. Well, in the first few months, we had over 100,000 members flock to join the union. We organized everyone, even the clerks who sold the tickets. We won our first victories without so much as a struggle. Our first serious strike in less than 2 weeks against the Great Northern Railroad, winning better wages, better working conditions, job security. But I guess another turning point came in 1894. Had to do with the town of Pullman. Now, you may have heard the name of Pullman. Mr. George Pullman made palace cars so that whenever the rich and famous of this country, the Rockefellers and the Cornelius Vanderbilts, would travel the country, they could do so in the manner to which they've become accustomed. Elegant, luxurious cars with everything you could possibly imagine. Well, the workers in Mr. Pullman's company town didn't live so high. It was just like a coal camp in West Virginia. They were paid with Pullman scrip. They lived in Pullman company houses. Their children attended a Pullman company school. They went to a Pullman church, and as one of my fellow workers said, when they died, they had to go to Pullman hell. Well, when Mr. Pullman, in the 1893 Depression, cut wages and hours of his workers by as much as half, he didn't lower the rent on his company houses, and he didn't lower the pay at the prices at the company store. While the workers and their families were sunk into horrible poverty, they asked for us to help. We tried to bring together people to come and visit the conditions in this camp, to try to recognize. We tried to bring Mr. Pullman to the table to bargain. He would have nothing to do with it. So eventually, we had to come to the aid of our brothers there, and the American Railroad Union decided that we would not haul any of Mr. Pullman's cars on any train going out of any railway line which we had control of. Now, at the time, our sole intent was to bring this arrogant person to the bargaining table to treat his workers justly. But what began as a simple conflict between one group of workers and an employer soon became a pitched battle, and what I came to see as a growing civil war, the war between capital and labor. For suddenly, while we were simply struggling for justice on the job, we found ourselves confronted not just with Mr. Pullman, but with the united hostility of all the railroad magnates, of all the robber barons of this country. Not only that, with all the political powers of this country, with corporation lawyers who are now judges issuing injunctions. Armed forces were sent in to put down what had been a peaceful strike. Injunctions were issued against us, making it impossible for me to speak or exercise any of the most basic constitutional rights. In a short period of time, the strike was broken. The ARU, American Railway Union, was nearly crushed, and I was sentenced to 6 months in prison. Now, people have often asked me how it was that I became a radical, I became a socialist. I can make it very clear. I was baptized in the fire of conflict, and there, in the midst of the conflict, in the gleam of the rifle barrels and the flash of the bayonets, the class struggle was revealed. And what is the class struggle? Let me make it very clear and simple to you, my friends. The modern world is increasingly divided into two main classes, the owning class and the working class. One class is small and rich. It has everything and does nothing. That's the owning class, the capitalist class. The other class is large and poor. It does everything and has nothing. That's the working class. And friends, the sole source of all the labor in the world, of all its wealth, is the labor of the working people. I came to see that between these two classes, a struggle would go on and on until the working people organized industrially through unions, but politically to gain power and freedom for all people. And that, friends, is how I became a socialist. Now, that's a word that scares people these days. If you want to see someone jump, just walk up behind them and say socialist and see how high they go. You've probably heard all kinds of things about us socialists, so maybe I should take care of that right off the bat. Some folks say that socialists want to rob working people of their property. Well, friends, I'm here to tell you that we couldn't do that if we wanted to, because the capitalist system has already robbed you of everything anyway. They say that socialists want to break up the family. Well, I'd like to challenge anyone who says that to come with me to any city and see what this capitalist system based on greed and exploitation has done to the family. Look at the crime, the homelessness, the poverty, drug addiction. Look at the sweatshops, look at the tenements, and tell me what a system based on profit and exploitation does for the family. Some people say that socialists are against religion. I've never been able to figure that one out, since the most successful labor strike in history was led by a certain Moses against a certain Pharaoh. And the greatest hero of the socialist movement, in fact, was a certain carpenter from Nazareth who was crucified by the ruling classes and the money changers of his day. No, friends, let me make it clear what socialists stand for. Very simple. The full development for the full chances for the full development of all people. That's the demand. Whoever denies it is a tyrant. Whoever does not demand it is a coward. Whoever is indifferent to it is a slave. Whoever doesn't desire it is dead. The whole earth for the whole people. That's the demand. The machinery of production and distribution, commonly owned and democratically managed for all the people in the interest of all the people. That's the demand. An end to poverty and misery, exploitation and degradation, the beginning of true democracy. This is the demand. This is socialism. So, friends, when I was released from prison, I was one of the founding members of the Socialist Party of America. And again, our ideas were that the working people cannot gain their liberation voting for capitalist politicians. It makes no sense. We have to have our own political party. We have to vote together as we work together, as we strike together. That's the only way out. And we hope to attain our aims peaceably through the ballot box. In 1900, I became the party's candidate for president of the United States. Traveled around the country. Got about 100,000 votes. I ran again in 1904, 1908, 1912, and again in 1920. Now, the time I ran for president in 1920 was a little bit unusual. I might should talk about that for those friends who don't know it. I believe I became the first convict to run for president of the United States. Not the first criminal. That had been done long ago, but the first convict. Now, for those of you who don't know, I was convicted of a terrible crime long about 1918, which we should probably talk about. My crime was that I gave a speech that the President of the United States didn't like very much. I've discovered in my lifetime that it can be a very dangerous thing to exercise your constitutional rights for free speech at a time when your country is making the world safe for democracy. I gave this speech during the last war in Europe between 1914, which began in 1914, seeing millions of people killed. And I said some things that I've said before many times. What I said was this: in general, if you look at history, it is always the rich and the powerful who have started the wars and have profited from them. It is always the working people who have fought them, whose bodies have been mangled, whose sons, daughters, husbands have been killed, orphans left behind. I gave this little speech and I was convicted of espionage. This was in Canton, Ohio. Now, if someone can explain to me how giving a speech in broad daylight is espionage, I'd like them to do that at some point after this speech. I was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And again, I wound up at Moundsville, West Virginia, one of my favorite prisons. I was transferred to the federal prison in Atlanta where I ran for president. I couldn't quite travel as much as I did. In fact, the warden only allowed me to issue a press release one time a week. The irony is I got 1 million votes that time when I ran for president. I think that's more than I got any other time. Well, I was released, not by Woodrow Wilson, but by Republican President Warren G. Harding in 1921. And now, with the years I have left, I'm doing what I can to rebuild the movement. But I want to close by saying something I said to the judge that day I was convicted. I said, "Your Honor, long ago I recognized my kinship with everyone that lived. I say then and I say now, where there is a lower class, I am in it. Where there's a criminal element, I am of it. And where there's a soul in prison, I am not free." Thank you.
We're back with today's guest, Mr. Eugene Debs. Mr. Debs, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
I'd like to ask you just a few questions now. First off, could you tell us a little bit about what your early days and your family and where and how you grew up?
Be glad to. My parents came to this country from Alsatia, Dandy and Daisy Debs, as everyone knew them. Very close, loving family. They had 6 children.
Alsatia is where in the world?
It was at the time contested territory between France and Germany, which was passed along several times, beginning in the War of 1870. And in fact, they left Europe to be free of that kind of conflict. Mm-hmm. They had 6 children. Again, I was the 3rd child and the oldest boy. Very close family. They shared a love of learning and a love of knowledge. We would read together, discuss at the dinner table the works of Goethe or Schiller, Rousseau, Voltaire, the great ideals of the French Revolution. I was named after 2 of my father's favorite French writers, Eugene Sue and Victor Hugo, who wrote about the common people and the struggles of the poor. So a lot of the ideals that I hold dear, I grew up with.
Mm-hmm. Of course, you grew up in the Midwest.
In Terre Haute, Indiana, yes, where I've lived my entire life.
Your involvement as an activist, I guess, is of course of great renown. And I was curious, was there a defining moment or a particular event, or was it sort of a cumulative effect in your life that compelled you to become an activist?
Well, at the time that I was growing up, Terre Haute, like many places in the country, had a very active civic life. People were involved in community organizations. I was a member of the Occidental Literary Club, where we would conduct speeches and bring in orators. There were various clubs and societies. So being involved with the community was a common thing. However, standing up for the rights of working people was a little bit of a different thing. And in some cases, that was very controversial, for working people who are considered to be hands and not human beings to organize on their own behalf. Probably the turning point in my life that finally set me on my course was the Pullman strike that I talked about earlier, when we were conducting a peaceful strike, trying to win just benefits for people and face the entire hostility of the ruling class, the government, the armed forces. That was a turning point in my life, one of many. But
what is your opinion of the Russian Revolution?
Well, initially in 1917, when the Russian Revolution happened and when Lenin and Trotsky removed Russia from the war and gave land to peasants, I was exalted. At the time, I proclaimed myself a Bolshevik from the crown of my shoes from the sole of my shoes to the crown of my head. Excuse me. The world was turned upside down at the time. You'll have to excuse me. But later, the developments in Russia came to disturb me. I saw that the Bolshevik Party was banning other political parties, closing down opposition newspapers, executing political opponents. So I protested to Lenin, to the Soviet government many times, sending telegrams of protest. I have come to believe that the Russian people simply exchanged one master for another, and that the Soviet model is no model and it doesn't represent socialism in any sense of the word.
Do you see yourself as a radical or an anarchist?
I think that's a very good question. Now, radical, if you look it up in a dictionary, comes from the word root. So I would hope that we're all radicals in the sense that we want to get to the root of the problem. And what I discovered in my life is the root of the problem for working people is an economic system based on exploitation. And that the only hope is to create a truly democratic system. So to that extent, I'm a radical. However, I always believe that working people should gain their liberation through peaceful and democratic means, through organizing in the workplace and through the ballot box, peacefully. I don't believe in violence. If the working class is well enough organized, they don't need violence, and if they're not, it won't be successful anyway, so it doesn't make sense. Now, as for being an anarchist, someone asked me that once, and I tried to explain as gently as possible that if I were an anarchist, I probably wouldn't have run for president 5 times, because anarchists want to abolish all forms of government. So,
You, of course, are no stranger to West Virginia. You've been here
Many
several times during your career. What are some of the lasting impressions that you have of your trips to West Virginia? At least, I don't want to get into the ones yet to Moundsville and the state penitentiary, but some of the labor efforts that you've been involved with in West Virginia.
well, I think when I think of West Virginia, first of all, I think of the beauty of the hills and the courage of the people. And also I think of the tyranny of the handful of corporations, particularly the coal companies, the stranglehold they had on workers living in coal camps, with the mine guard system of brutality, with people being deprived of their lives for trying to organize, being detained without charges for basically a reign of terror. So I think some of the most heroic struggles of the working people anywhere in the world took place in West Virginia.
You mentioned in your talk earlier that Moundsville was your favorite favorite penitentiary.
Yes, I've been in 3 prisons, and Moundsville is my favorite. Yes.
And you mentioned that you were sent to Moundsville as the result of a speech that you gave in Canton, Ohio, against the Great War. And I was just curious, how did that come to be, or why were you sent to West Virginia as a result of?
I'm still trying to figure that out myself. I gave a speech merely, and I didn't really address the war that much, except to say that usually it consists of working people killing each other for the benefit of the wealthy. But, well, I guess I did say that there. But the point of I was trying to address the issue of the climate of the United States at the time, when people were being sent to prison for no crime simply because of their political belief, when people were using the war hysteria to break unions, to break strikes, to attack the gains of working people. And I was standing up against that tide. And again, I was convicted under the Espionage Act. And again, how something that you've said hundreds of times that you do in broad daylight in public could constitute espionage, I never understood. Someone told me that there were going to be government agents there taking down my notes that day, and it didn't bother me because I thought they had to learn this stuff sooner or later, and it might as well be for my speech. But
could have helped them.
Because that was, yeah. So I wound up in Moundsville first, because Moundsville was one site where federal prisoners were housed. And, the warden, Joseph C. Terrell, was a very, very good friend of mine. I knew many of the inmates. I would help them write letters home and try to help them with their problems. Many of them were guilty of nothing more than being poor.
Finally, what would you yet like to achieve, or would you like to see the labor movement achieve?
I guess probably the core belief of my life is that no one rises from the ranks, that we're all in this together. And if my life has meant anything, it means that when we rise, we need to all come up together. And if I've contributed in any way to that, I know I won't see the cause that seemed to be so close a few years back. I know I'll never live to see that, but just to keep that image alive. And I know that when conditions are right, once again, the direction of history will take people to freedom.
Okay. Well, at this time, I would like to introduce the presenter of Eugene Debs, and this is Mr. Rick Wilson of Milton, West Virginia. Rick is the director of the West Virginia Economic Justice Project, which is under the auspices of the American Friends Service Committee. Rick, thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Rick is one of our many talented History Alive roster folks, and I'll ask you what I ask pretty much everyone, which is what interested you in the character that you portray? What was it about Eugene Debs that moved you to want to do this?
Well, for one thing, I'm really interested in labor history, and I don't think people have been taught much about not just strikes and struggles and unions, but the common, ordinary life of working people just as they get by. If you look at most history books, it's about generals and presidents and kings, and I think so much of labor history, the most dramatic events happened right here in West Virginia, that it's good to draw attention to that. And I think Debs was a character who was very idealistic, and even at the time, even people who thought he was crazy politically liked him as a person. And I think people like Debs are in danger of being forgotten. And also, I must say that if I would have thought the Humanities Council would have actually accepted my proposal to be Debs, I never would have sent it in to start with. So.
Well, you never know.
Yeah, I can't joke with some people.
Well, we're glad that you did, and we're very pleased that you're part of the program for sure. What sort of research sources did you have available, and did you go to when you were putting together your character?
Okay. Well, there are several excellent biographies of Eugene Debs, which I took advantage of, and there are a number of published collections of his letters and correspondence, which I found very useful. Actually, a West Virginia scholar, Dr. Fred Barkey, wrote a dissertation about the history of the Socialist Party in West Virginia, which was really invaluable. I also traveled to Terre Haute to Debs's home, which is now a museum, which has been furnished and restored by many labor unions around the country, and visited his house, his artifacts, read through old socialist publications, and sort of worked on the performance. The thing about Debs was he was not a very complicated person. What you see is what you got. He was very sentimental and idealistic, and figuring him out, he's not Hamlet.
Was he well thought of by West Virginians?
I think he really had a great deal of popularity here, and he, in his prime, he was a great orator who would hold people spellbound for hours at a time, even if they didn't speak English. And I'm portraying Debs at an older point in his life after he's given up the lecture circuit, because I, Rick, could never talk like him for real. I mean, he was quite a spellbinder.
What were the circumstances around Debs' later years? I mean, when did he die, and what was he doing later on?
Well, his health, when he got out of prison, I think he finally got released was about 1922, and he was nearly 70 years old. His health was broken, not just from the prison, the bad food there, but I mean, he spent his life literally on the road, traveling around the country, living in hotels and eating whatever food was there, for the labor movement, for the Socialist Party and things. And I think he just wore himself down and out. I mean, it wasn't any dramatic health crisis. He died in 1926 at age 71.
Oh, okay.
And he had, a lot of miles on that body. So.
Finally, here in the last 30 seconds or so, how do you think that Debs would respond to the issues of today?
Debs lived in a really optimistic period when he thought really there was hope for the world. It's getting harder and harder to have that optimistic view. I think the issues in his life about justice for working people, about freedom of speech in a time of war, in an age when a lot of benefits that working people have enjoyed are under attack, when the gap between rich and poor is growing. His prescription probably won't do it, but the issues he talked about are still with us.
Well, Rick, I want to really thank you again for being here today. And I know that you've been on the History Alive roster now for a little over a year, I guess, and as a popular character for us. And thank you for watching History Alive.